A woman sits alone in a crowded bar, her wrist marked by strange numbers and a fractured triangle, something personal, something sacred. Laughter erupts nearby as two young soldiers mock her tattoo, thinking she's just another forgettable face in the crowd. But when three Navy SEALs rise from the shadows without saying a single word, the entire room learns a lesson about silence, sacrifice, and respect. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story carries even more heart, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Margarett Heathers never looked like she belonged. That was her quiet advantage. She moved through places like smoke, unseen, soft around the edges, never drawing attention until someone tried too hard to stare. Her shoulders bore no rank now, her walk no longer tightened by protocol, but there was still a precision in how she moved, not stiff, not trained, but considered, like every step mattered. And on this particular night, that was enough to unsettle at least one table in the back of the Mule's End. She sat at a corner booth, alone, a dark glass of something bitter resting loosely in her fingers. The sleeves of her olive-green utility jacket were rolled halfway up, exposing a wrist with a tattoo that didn't belong to the kind of woman you expect to drink alone on a Friday night. Black numbers. 10,467. Beside them, a broken triangle, its lines jagged and unfinished, like a symbol shattered mid-construction. Some folks stared at it like it was a puzzle. Others, like the bartender, Tucker Davis, never asked. He already knew what it meant. But not Kyle Jensen. Kyle was 22, maybe. Young enough to be dumb, old enough to think he wasn't. He was 2 beers deep, laughing with his buddy Brandon Chase at the next table over. They'd come in wearing guard hoodies, fresh from drill or pretending to be, National Guard, full of the kind of energy that only hovers right between boredom and bravado. "Hey," Kyle called out, elbowing Brandon, "check this out." Margarett didn't move. She never looked up. Her fingers brushed the rim of her glass, dragging a soft circle around it. She knew the sound. She knew the tempo. She knew what was about to come. "Nice ink, lady," Kyle said, louder this time. "What is that, your cat's birthday or the Wi-Fi password to Langley?" Brandon snorted into his drink. Kyle grinned, emboldened. "No, wait, let me guess. Prisoner number? Or maybe a secret cult?" That's when Margarett lifted her head. Not fast, not slow. Just enough to meet his eyes. No glare, no bite. Just a glance. Steady, measured. Like a carpenter checking a level before hammering the nail. Brandon chuckled again, but softer now. Tucker glanced up from behind the bar, drying the same glass he'd been working on for 5 minutes. His eyes narrowed slightly. The room hadn't gone quiet yet, but it was tipping. Margarett turned back to her drink and took a sip. "Okay, Rude," Kyle muttered, still smiling, but less sure of it. "Guess I hit a nerve." "Or maybe you just missed the point," Tucker said, setting the glass down with a dull thud. Kyle ignored him. He was hunting a reaction, and it irritated him not to get one. He stood up from his stool and took a slow step toward Margarett's booth. Brandon stayed seated, but leaned forward, his grin plastered on like he was watching a sitcom unfold. "You got a name to go with that attitude?" Kyle asked, now standing over her, arms crossed. "Or are we just playing mysterious loner all night?" Margarett didn't flinch. She let the silence sit a moment longer, heavy and deliberate. Then she finally responded. Voice low, clear, and calm. "It's not attitude," she said, "it's restraint." Something in her tone struck a nerve. Not angry, not confrontational, just matter-of-fact, like someone pointing out an inconvenient truth. Kyle shifted on his feet, the grin faltering. "You got a problem, lady? You're the one standing at my table." For a second, the room paused. Just a breath. The kind of quiet that slips in right before something sharp. Then Kyle laughed, too loud, too forced. "Man, you're something else." He turned to Brandon. "She's got jokes." That was when Brandon's expression began to change. Not much, just a subtle tilt of the head, his eyes moving toward the far corner of the bar. There, 3 figures sat in the shadows. Had been sitting there the whole time, but now they moved. No sound, no announcement. Just motion. The first to rise was broad-shouldered, square-jawed, with a high-end type that hadn't grown out much since his last mission. He wore a flannel shirt over a faded SEALs tee, sleeves rolled tight against forearms lined with scars that told more than any badge ever could. That was Rip Lawson. Next to him, Derek Nash stood. Wiry, intense, a storm always brewing behind the eyes. He cracked his neck once, the only sound he made. Then Mason Briggs, last to stand. Taller than the other 2, quieter, but with a gaze that could cut glass. He didn't look angry. He didn't look anything. He just watched. They didn't walk quickly, didn't puff their chests. They simply approached. Kyle hadn't noticed yet. Brandon had. "Dude," Brandon whispered, "we should—" "What?" Kyle turned. "What's the matter? Why—" He stopped. The words didn't finish. Rip stepped between Margarett and Kyle, his back to her, eyes fixed on the younger man. Kyle blinked, his brain trying to categorize what he was looking at. "Hey, he glanced toward Brandon. "No help there." "You guys got a problem?" Kyle tried, voice a bit higher than before. None of them answered. Rip's stare didn't waver. Derek's eyes flared once, just enough to suggest he was deciding whether or not Kyle was worth the energy. Mason tilted his head slightly. Kyle looked between them. His arms dropped to his sides. I didn't mean anything," he mumbled. "It was a joke." Still no words, just presence, heavy, deliberate. Brandon stood up, chair scraping loudly. "Let's go, man." "Yeah," Kyle said quickly. "Yeah, sure." They backed away, stumbling over their own silence, then beelined for the door, never looking back. The 3 SEALs didn't follow, didn't nod, didn't speak. They just stood there for a beat longer before slowly returning to their table in the corner. Margarett hadn't moved. Her hand still rested on the glass. She exhaled once, not relief, just release. Tucker leaned forward on the bar, watching the scene settle. "You good?" he asked. Margarett nodded. Wasn't gonna let them win. He poured her another without asking. "I know," he said. "But it's good to be reminded. Some folks still know what that ink means." She offered the faintest smile, then turned back to the drink. In a corner of the bar that always remembered more than it revealed, Margarett Heathers became unforgettable. And the mule's end, Rimba remembered. There was a smell that never really left your memory. Not blood, not sand. It was somewhere in between. Sunburned Kevlar and gun oil, mingled with the electric sharpness of adrenaline right before it breaks into fight. Margarett hadn't smelled it in years, but when Kyle leaned over her table, that scent came back, not from him. He wouldn't know it if it punched him in the chest, from her memory rising behind her eyes like smoke. And now that the bar had settled, now that the 3 SEALs had retreated to their corner, it lingered like static in her spine. She turned the glass in her hand, watching the amber liquid ripple under the dim lights. The room had gone back to its usual rhythm, boots scraping, pool balls clacking, jukebox humming an old Skinnerd song that probably hadn't been cool since the 80s. But everything felt heavier now, quieter, even if it wasn't. The numbers on her wrist caught the light again. 10,467, stamped in black ink, hard angles, and military font. Beside them, the broken triangle. 3 uneven sides, fractured like a window hit by a single precise bullet. No one really knew what it meant, unless they'd worn a different kind of uniform. Not the kind Kyle had paraded around in, but the kind that didn't come off even when you tried to bury it under civilian clothes. Margarett leaned back against the booth. Her muscles ached. They always did after nights like this, when the world made her remember instead of letting her forget. "Still good?" Tucker's voice brought her back, gruff but not unkind. She looked up, nodded once. "Better than I could have been." Tucker poured another glass and walked it over himself this time, setting it down with the practiced ease of someone who'd seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore. "They knew," he said quietly, glancing toward the corner where the SEALs had resumed their quiet conversation. "Didn't have to say a word." "They never do," Margarett replied. There was a pause between them, full of things unsaid. "You ever run with any of them?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "No," she said. "Different theaters, but you can tell." He nodded slowly, the way you do when a thought connects a little deeper than expected. "I figured. That tattoo. It's one of those, isn't it?" She looked at him for a moment, long enough for him to regret asking. But she didn't shut him down. "It's a grid ID? Forward operating base I worked out of in Helmand, 2011, she said finally. "We didn't have names for those places, just numbers. That one stuck." Tucker didn't press further, he just let the silence breathe. "You intel?" he asked. She smirked faintly. "You ask a lot of questions for a man who usually pretends not to know things." "Only when I know the answer already," he replied. She paused, then let the smirk widen just a hair. "Yeah." "Intel. Naval." She looked back at the tattoo. "Embedded with teams for 16 months, mostly recon support, some target verification, signals, comms, sometimes interrogation, sometimes darker." The last word hung between them like smoke from a cigarette, neither of them lit. Tucker leaned against the edge of the booth. "You the reason some of the bad guys just vanished off the map?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Some of them." He nodded slowly, as if that lined up perfectly with what he'd already guessed. Margarett took a sip of her drink, the ice having mostly melted now. It didn't matter. The taste wasn't what she was after. "You ever think about it?" Tucker asked, breaking the silence after a long moment. "Every day," she replied. "I mean, how different it could have gone if things had gone just a little sideways." She looked at him, then away. "Tucker, things did go sideways." He let out a single dry laugh. "Yeah, guess I didn't phrase that right." The music shifted in the background, an old Garth Brooks track rolling in like an afterthought. The kind of song that felt like driving too far into nowhere with nothing but regrets in the glove box. Margarett stared into the crowd again. It looked the same. It always looked the same. Soldiers fresh from deployment trying to laugh a little too loud, women pretending they weren't watching the door, men who still sat with their backs to the wall, even if they didn't realize why anymore. She recognized the signs. Always had. You don't come back from a place like Camp 10,467 without your vision changing. "I had a translator once," she said suddenly, her voice quiet like the words had to sneak out. "His name was Ahmed. He wasn't supposed to get attached. Neither was I. But those nights in the bunkers, we were all human. He taught me how to read tone shifts in Pashto just by watching someone's shoulders." She paused. He was killed by a bike bomb 2 weeks before I rotated home." Tucker didn't respond. He just waited. She wasn't talking to get comfort. She was talking because sometimes the only way to hold on to someone was to say their name out loud again. "They asked me if I wanted a medal for that tour," she said after a moment. "I told them to give it to his sister." "Did they?" he asked. She shook her head. Never heard back. The hum of conversation swelled again. Pool balls clacked louder. A group near the jukebox whooped at a punchline no one else heard. Life continued like it always did, unconcerned with what anyone carried. "Tell me something, Tucker," she said, turning toward him. "You ever look at someone and just know?" "Know what?" But if he scratched the surface, they'd bleed stories. He nodded. "Every night." Margarett turned her eyes toward the seals again. Rip had returned to his beer. Derek was leaned back with his arms crossed, eyes half closed but still tracking every movement in the room. Mason was quietly tapping his fingers against the table in an old rhythm. An extraction pattern, probably. Some things never left. "They weren't just standing for me," she said softly. "They were standing for someone they lost. Maybe a sister, maybe a teammate, maybe just an idea. Or all of the above," Tucker said. She looked at him, her eyes tired but alive. "You think they'll come back tomorrow?" Tucker shrugged. "Maybe. Maybe not. But if they do, the place will remember." Margarett finished the rest of her drink and stood, the ache in her knees reminding her of nights slept in places that didn't deserve names. "I'll be back next week," she said, grabbing her coat. "You always say that." "I always mean it." She paused at the door, just long enough to glance back at the three figures in the corner. One of them raised a glass in her direction. Subtle, almost imperceptible. She nodded once and stepped out into the dark, and the mule's end exhaled. Brandon Chase always played the follower. That was his thing. He'd figured out early in life that if you weren't strong, you could get by on loyalty. Just latch onto someone louder, meaner, more reckless, and laugh at all the right moments. Kyle Jensen had been that someone since they were both 18, pulling guard duty 2 states away from home and pretending it was the same thing as deployment. It wasn't. But you couldn't tell Kyle that. He wasn't a bad guy. Not really. Not evil. Just shallow. The kind of man who thought a sharp haircut and a camo hoodie gave him license to speak for a uniform he hadn't earned in full. He liked to push people, especially the quiet ones. Especially when he had an audience. Brandon sipped his beer and stared at the booth where the woman had sat. She was gone now. But the tension hadn't left with her. "The tension hadn't left with her," said Brandon. "As he intended it to." "I mean, she didn't even say anything," Kyle muttered, still visibly annoyed, though trying to laugh it off. "Just sat there, like we weren't even talking to her." Brandon shifted in his seat. He hadn't said much during the exchange earlier, but now that Margarett Heathers had left, the weight of what happened lingered like the smell of cordite after a misfire. He didn't feel guilty, exactly, but he did feel watched. "She didn't have to," Brandon finally said. "Those guys did it for her." Kyle scoffed. "Yeah, whatever. She didn't look like anything special, just another bitter vet with an attitude problem." Brandon didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the back corner of the bar. The 3 men hadn't left. They were still sitting there, quiet, unmoved. Rip had barely sipped his beer. Derek was leaning back with his arms folded, eyes low but still scanning. Mason hadn't blinked in minutes, it seemed. "You know what her tattoo meant?" Brandon asked, surprising himself. Kyle made a dismissive sound. "Probably some inside joke, or she just wants people to ask, get attention." Brandon shook his head. "It wasn't for us. That's the point. That's what made it different." Kyle narrowed his eyes, his voice dropping. "Are you seriously defending her right now?" "I'm not defending anything," Brandon said. "I'm just saying, something about it felt different." "Yeah, well, maybe you should have joined the Margarett Heathers fan club instead of the National Guard," Kyle snapped. Brandon looked down at his drink, then back at the seals. One of them, Rip, met his gaze briefly. Not with aggression, not with anger. Just that unreadable calm that comes from years of seeing real problems. The kind of calm that doesn't have time for boys pretending to be wolves. Across the room, Tucker cleaned a glass for the 4th time and watched the entire scene unfold like a man who had seen this pattern before. Young men making noise, veterans making silence, and somewhere in between, the cost of not understanding the difference. Tucker finally set the glass down, walked out from behind the bar, and made his way toward Kyle and Brandon's table. "Everything all right here?" he asked casually, though his voice carried a weight it didn't need to raise. Kyle leaned back, eyebrows raised. "Yeah, why wouldn't it be?" Tucker gave him a long look, then turned his attention to Brandon. "You got a decent head on your shoulders. Try using it." Brandon blinked. "I didn't." "I know," Tucker said. "That's what I'm talking about." He turned to Kyle next. "You know, some folks come in here to forget. Some come to remember. But none of them come to be your entertainment." Kyle scoffed. "Since when is asking a question a crime?" "It's not," Tucker said. "But what you did wasn't a question. It was a test, and you failed it." Kyle's face reddened. She didn't even say anything back. How was that a failure? "Because," Tucker said, stepping closer, "you weren't looking for a conversation. You were looking for control." The room had gone quieter again. Not dead silent, but close. Conversations dipped. The jukebox faded out between tracks. "I've seen your type before," Tucker added. "Plenty of times. Loud until it counts. Brave until it matters." Kyle opened his mouth, but Tucker cut him off with a gesture. "You see those 3, he said, nodding toward the seals. "They didn't stand up because of what you said. They stood up because of what she didn't say." Kyle looked toward the corner. The seals hadn't moved. "That tattoo," Tucker continued. "That's not some cute inside joke. That's a badge. One you can't buy. One you don't mock. It's from a world you'll never understand." Randall shifted again. What did it mean? Tucker glanced at him. For a second he considered answering. Then he shook his head. "If you knew," he said softly, "you wouldn't have to ask." He walked away without another word. Kyle looked down at his beer, the bravado bleeding from his face. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a comeback, and Brandon just sat there, staring into space, like the gravity of what happened had finally pulled him into place. Over in the far booth, Derek said something under his breath that made Rip crack a slight grin. Mason was still quiet, tapping the side of his glass like he was waiting for time to catch up with him. None of them looked toward Kyle or Brandon again. They didn't have to. By the time the next song started playing on the jukebox, the Mule's End had already decided which story it was going to remember. And it wasn't the one Kyle tried to write. No signal passed between them. No glance, no nod, nothing spoken. But when Rip Lawson stood, the others stood too. It was muscle memory now, something deeper than habit. You move when it's time. You don't need to ask why. Rip's boots hit the floor first, the thud too soft for most to hear, but for those who knew what to listen for, it was deafening. Derek Nash unfolded from his seat like a spring, released, his long arms loose at his sides, jaw set. Mason Briggs rose last, slow and precise, like he was measuring the moment. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Presence was its own kind of violence when done right. Brandon noticed first, mid-sip, eyes drifting to the corner. The glass didn't make it to his mouth. It hovered in the air, forgotten. Kyle, he muttered, nudging his friend. Kyle, still agitated, still full of leftover bravado, rolled his eyes. What now? Brandon nodded toward the booth. They're coming. Kyle turned in his seat just as the three seals began their slow approach. Rip led, hands in his pockets, eyes forward. Derek followed a step behind, head tilted slightly, almost curious. Mason didn't blink. They didn't walk like men going into a fight. They walked like men who'd already decided how it would end. Kyle stood halfway, uncertain if he should greet them or square up. "Hey, something I can help you with?" Rip didn't stop until he was close enough to smell the beer on Kyle's breath. His face remained unreadable, calm, even kind if you didn't know better. Derek didn't speak either, but the way he positioned himself, shoulders loose, hands near his belt, sent a message clearer than words. "Don't." Kyle laughed once, nervous, taking a step back. "Look, I didn't mean anything, just having a little fun." Rip tilted his head, one corner of his mouth tightening. Not a smile, but something older. Something more dangerous. "Your idea of fun?" Rip asked, finally breaking the silence. His voice was low, firm, not loud, but it carried through the room like a switch being flipped. Kyle blinked, suddenly aware of how close the walls felt. "I mean, it wasn't, serious. She didn't seem to mind." "She shouldn't have to mind," Rip said. "She didn't owe you a reaction." Brandon was sinking into his seat now, eyes locked on the floor. Derek took a slow step forward, just close enough that Kyle had to choose between backing up or standing still. He stood still, but it was forced now. Thin. "Do you know what those numbers meant?" Derek asked. Kyle swallowed. "Some kind of base? I don't know." Mason spoke for the first time, voice even and dry. "Forward operating base 10,467, Helmand Province. Buried under sand now, but the ghosts still walk it." Kyle didn't respond. "She served there," Mason added. "We knew the code. That triangle, it's the insignia for Task Element Iron Volt. Intel fusion, deep recon, forward support, the kind of people who get no headlines and no parades." Derek stepped slightly to the side, giving Kyle enough space to walk away, but not enough to pretend he wasn't choosing not to. "You wore a hoodie," Derek said. "She wore the mission." Rip didn't blink. "Next time you want to play tough, make sure you're not in someone else's war zone." Kyle opened his mouth again, but there were no words. Nothing felt right. Not sarcasm, not apology. He just stood there, breathing heavier than the moment called for. Then Tucker's voice cut in, quiet and cool behind the bar. "I'd suggest you sit down, Kyle, not for their sake, for yours." Kyle looked around the room. Heads had turned, not all, but enough. The kind of quiet that fell when something sacred had just been disturbed. He backed away slowly and sat down. The SEALs didn't follow. They turned, just as slow, just as quiet, and walked back to their table in the corner, the air parting for them like water. When they sat down, the room didn't go back to normal. It adjusted, recalibrated. The Mule's End wasn't a place for cowards tonight. Brandon leaned in, his voice a whisper now, almost afraid to speak. "What do we do now?" Kyle shook his head. "Nothing. We don't do anything." They sat there, shrinking into themselves, trying to act invisible now. But invisibility wasn't a thing you got to choose. Margarett had shown them that. At the bar, Tucker refilled a glass and wiped the same stretch of counter for the 5th time, his eyes flickering toward the SEALs. Rip leaned forward slightly, his hands folded, speaking to Mason in a voice no one else could hear. Derek glanced once toward the door, then back to the bar, then at the empty booth where Margarett had sat. "She didn't flinch," he said quietly. "No," Rip agreed. "She didn't need to. Wish more people understood what that kind of silence costs," Mason added. "Maybe they will now," Rip said. A pool ball cracked in the distance. A woman's laugh rang out near the jukebox. Slowly life resumed. but it did so around something unspoken, the kind of moment that etches itself into the wood grain of a place. The Mule's End had witnessed it, and it would remember. It was Mason who said it first, low enough that no one beyond their table heard. He shook. Rip nodded once, not in satisfaction, not in judgment, just recognition. Kyle had shaken. Not physically, he wasn't weak in that way, but something in his core wavered. The bluff cracked, and when a man like Rip saw that crack, he filed it away. Not out of cruelty, just habit. He'd spent too many years reading people under pressure to pretend the tells didn't matter. Across the room, Kyle sat stiff in his chair, his back unnaturally straight. Brandon kept sipping his beer like it might dull the discomfort, but it wasn't working. He looked more like a kid holding a grown man's glass, trying to play a part he didn't fit into. The bar wasn't loud anymore. Conversations had picked up again, but they moved around the center of the room like a river skirting a rock, flowing but diverted. Eyes darted occasionally toward the back corner where the seals sat, but no one stared for too long. No one wanted to draw attention. Not anymore. Tucker leaned against the bar, arms crossed, watching it all unfold with a stillness that made him seem more statue than man. He wasn't the kind to gloat, but he knew the feeling of watching someone learn a lesson they didn't ask for. It usually didn't happen all at once. It came in waves. First the humiliation, then the denial, and finally the cold, unwelcome understanding. Rip tapped his finger once against the wood of the table. A steady rhythm. 1, 2. Pause. "I remember when silence used to scare me," Derek said suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. Mason glanced over, eyes steady. "When?" "First deployment. Night patrol in Fallujah," Derek replied. "I was 19. Heard nothing for an hour straight. Thought we were walking into an ambush." Rip smiled faintly. "We were." Derek nodded. "Yeah, we were. But I didn't know it then. I just knew the quiet was heavy, like the ground was listening." "That's the kind of silence she had," Mason said. Rip looked toward the empty booth where Margarett had sat. The chair hadn't been touched since she left. Her glass still had a little liquid at the bottom, ice melted, condensation ring marking her place like a badge no one dared wipe away. "She knew what would happen," Rip said. "Didn't need to raise her voice. Didn't need to posture. She just waited." "That's the difference," Derek added, "between someone who's seen it and someone who plays at it." Meanwhile, Kyle fidgeted in his seat. Brandon had stopped trying to engage. The silence between them had shifted from camaraderie to discomfort. It was the kind of quiet that builds walls. Finally, Kyle spoke, his voice sharp with forced bravado. "What, so now they think they're heroes?" Brandon looked over slowly. "You still don't get it, do you?" Kyle's face tightened. "What's there to get? We didn't touch her. Didn't even curse at her." "You didn't have to," Brandon said. "You mocked her for something you didn't understand. That tattoo? It wasn't for you. It wasn't even for us. It was for the people who never made it back." Kyle looked away. "I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Brandon corrected him. "And that's worse." Tucker walked past them again, carrying a glass of water to a table near the jukebox. As he passed, he paused briefly at Kyle and Brandon's table. He didn't speak. He just looked. Second, two, then moved on. It was enough. Brandon leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "They didn't threaten us, didn't touch us, but I've never felt smaller in my life." Kyle didn't reply. At the SEALs table, the conversation had shifted. Rip was now watching the door, eyes tracking the next customer to enter. A tall man in a hunting vest stepped inside, nodded to Tucker, and took a seat without looking around. Another regular. Another chapter in the long, unwritten story of the Mule's End. You think she'll come back? Mason asked. Rip didn't answer right away. She will, Derek said. People like her, they always come back. They've been alone for too long to stop showing up where they feel seen. Rip nodded. And after tonight, this place knows her. Mason looked toward the booth. That mark on her wrist. I'd seen it before. Kabul, one of the black sites near the airstrip. A guy from Delta had it inked on his chest. Same numbers, same triangle. Said it reminded him where the darkness lived. Derek rubbed the back of his neck. It's not just a memory. It's a warning. A map, Rip said, so the rest of us don't get lost. They sat in silence for a few moments longer, letting the weight of their words settle. Then Rip stood. Tucker caught the motion, walked back to the register, and started printing the tab before Rip even got there. You didn't have to stand, Tucker said as he handed over the check. I didn't, Rip replied. I wanted to. Tucker nodded once. That's the difference. Rip slid a few bills across the counter. She's one of the good ones. They all are, Tucker said. Until we forget, then they have to remind us. Rip looked him in the eye. Let's try not to forget again. No promises, Tucker said. But I'll do my part. Derek and Mason followed Rip out the door. No grand exit, no stairs. Just the quiet dignity of men who had come to do one thing and done it. Brandon watched them leave, then turned to Kyle. Maybe next time, don't speak unless you're sure the room isn't filled with people who've buried friends over that symbol. Kyle didn't respond. His face was pale now. Not from fear, from realization. The kind that comes too late. Brandon stood and walked to the bar. Can I get a water? Tucker poured it without a word and slid it across. You gonna be okay? He asked. Brandon nodded. I think I just started to understand something. Tucker gave him a long look, then went back to cleaning the counter. Good. Try not to forget it. And the mule's end carried the weight of what had happened that night, not with noise, but with memory. Quiet. Permanent. The kind of memory that changes a place from just a bar into something more sacred. The next morning came with the smell of stale beer and pine sol, the ghosts of last night hanging in the rafters. Tucker Davis unlocked the front door to the mule's end at precisely 9:45, same as he always did. The town was quiet on Saturdays, still waking up, but the bar felt different today. Quieter than the quiet, like the walls had absorbed too much and were still processing it. He didn't turn on the music, didn't flip on the neon beer signs, just let the natural light bleed in through the blinds and started wiping down the booth where Margarett had sat. The glass was still there, the ring of condensation still faintly visible. No one had touched it since she left. He could have cleaned it last night, but something about it didn't feel right, like the place had needed to sleep with the memory intact. He didn't hear the door open, but he felt it. Soft boots, steady steps, no hesitation. Tucker didn't look up right away. He just kept wiping. Then came the voice. Calm, cool, familiar. Thought you might be open. Margarett Heathers stood in the doorway, jacket zipped, eyes sharp but tired. There was a backpack slung over one shoulder and a small patch stitched onto the strap, weathered, nearly invisible unless you knew to look. A faint outline of that broken triangle. Tucker nodded, still not looking at her. Wasn't sure if you'd be back. I said I would be, she said. People say a lot of things in bars, Tucker muttered. Margarett slid into the same booth as before, leaned back like it belonged to her now. But not me. Tucker finally looked at her, giving her a long once-over. You good? I'm fine. He gave a short grunt. Doesn't mean the same thing when someone like you says it. No, she agreed. It doesn't. He poured her a glass of water and set it down without asking. Then he pulled up a chair across from her, elbows resting on his knees. "They stuck around after you left," he said. "I know. They didn't say your name. They didn't have to." Tucker exhaled through his nose. "One of them," Mason said he saw the same tattoo in Kabul. Black site outside the Strip. Margarett nodded slowly. "He would have. We were running an intelligence handoff pipeline through there. I ran Overwatch on some of the units. Not supposed to talk about it." "I didn't hear anything," Tucker said. "Didn't say anything," she replied. "Oh." They sat in silence for a moment, both absorbing what wasn't being said. Tucker tapped a finger on the table, eyes drifting to her wrist. "What made you get it inked?" Margarett followed his gaze. "I never meant to. At first it was just written on the inside of my gear, inside the flap by the zipper. Someplace private. I didn't want to forget." She paused, tracing the tattoo lightly with her fingers. "But after my last op," she continued, "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, it was just numbers, coordinates, radio callouts, people screaming in accents that didn't make it through the headset." Tucker said nothing. Margarett looked up. "So I had it put here, not for show, just so that when I saw it, I'd remember what mattered, where we were, who didn't come home." Tucker leaned back in his chair. "I had a buddy in Afghanistan. Medic. He used to tattoo the initials of soldiers he couldn't save behind his ear. Said it was so they'd never be forgotten. That way someone was still carrying them, even if it wasn't in a casket." Margarett's face softened. "That sounds right." Tucker looked at her again, then down at the tabletop. "You were alone last night. They didn't know that, but you were. Yeah, and you stayed quiet." "I've been called worse," she said. "By better men." Tucker smirked, despite himself. "Still, you let them burn themselves, let the room see it." "Sometimes silence is the sharpest blade," Margarett replied, "especially when you're not the one holding it." Tucker nodded slowly. And they stood. She exhaled, her voice low. "That was the part I wasn't expecting." "Like sec, my nun. I've been invisible for so long," she said. "You get used to people looking through you. Not past you, through you. Like you don't belong. Like you're a glitch in the system, too hard to explain, easier to ignore." "They didn't ignore you," Tucker said. "No. They remembered." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small cloth patch, worn and faded. She laid it gently on the table between them. It was the triangle, broken at one side. Same symbol, but frayed from use. "I've been carrying this since my rotation ended," she said. "It belonged to my CO, Captain Darian Rhodes. He died in that FOB. Saved 3 of us before the roof came down. He used to say, 'Symbols only matter if they're heavy enough to carry someone else's weight.'" Tucker stared at the patch. "You ever think about letting it go?" "Every day," she said. "And every day I don't." The door opened again behind them. Not loud, just enough to remind them the world kept moving. Tucker glanced over. Brandon stood in the doorway, hat in hand. No hoodie today, just a faded t-shirt and jeans. He looked different. Not scared, not defiant, just uncertain. Margarett looked over, then back at her glass. Tucker raised his eyebrows. "You want me to tell him to leave?" She shook her head. "Let's see what he does." Brandon approached the table, slowly, awkwardly, like someone walking through a minefield of memory. He stopped a few feet from the booth, cleared his throat. "Miss," he said, I wanted to say I was out of line last night." Margarett didn't speak. "I didn't know what that tattoo meant," he continued. "Didn't know anything about you. But now I do. A little anyway. And I'm sorry." Still no response. Brandon hesitated, then turned to go. Just before he reached the door, Margarett finally spoke. "Don't apologize to me," she said. "Apologize to the silence." Brandon paused. "What do you mean? Every time someone like me stays quiet about what we've seen, it's because the world never earned the right to hear it," she said. "But last night, the silence got loud, because someone finally listened." Brandon turned back to face her, eyes steady now. "Then thank you for letting it be heard." She nodded, just once, and he left. Tucker looked back at Margarett. "You planning to stay in town long?" He shrugged. "Long enough." "For what?" She looked toward the window. Sunlight was starting to push through the blinds now, breaking up the shadows. "For the next person who needs someone to remember," she said. Tucker smiled, and the mule's end, quiet as ever, stood ready to hold that memory. A week passed, maybe more. Time didn't matter much in towns like this, just the rhythm of footsteps on old wood floors and the dependable sound of Tucker's hands polishing a glass he'd washed 10 times already. The mule's end wasn't fancy. It wasn't fast, but it was known. Known for being the place where people could sit without being asked who they were, what they'd done, or why they sat facing the door, and Margarett Heathers had returned every day since. She didn't always talk. Sometimes she sat in silence, sometimes she helped Tucker fix a stubborn shelf behind the bar, and sometimes she simply listened to the quiet hum of the place breathing around her. But she was there, present, occupying a space the town hadn't realized it needed filled until she walked back through its door. And by then, something had shifted. The regulars didn't stare at the tattoo anymore. Some offered a nod. Others brought her a beer and left it on the table without a word. Even the jukebox seemed to play differently. Less rowdy, more thoughtful. People didn't crowd her. They didn't press. But the energy had changed. The bar knew her now, and it respected her. On a Thursday evening, just after the sun dipped below the tree line, the Seals came back. No fanfare, no warning. They walked in like they had the first time, quiet, focused, unhurried. Rip Lawson gave a nod to Tucker, who returned it with one of his own. Derek Nash scanned the room like he always did, and Mason Briggs took the corner booth before anyone else could claim it. Routine, precise, unspoken choreography. Margarett was already sitting at her usual spot. She watched them walk in, but didn't wave. Didn't smile, just gave a single nod. Rip paused, then crossed the floor and approached her booth. "Mind if I sit?" Margarett motioned to the seat across from her. "Long as you don't expect a thank you speech." Rip cracked a small smile. "Didn't expect one, then?" "Don't need one now." He slid into the seat, posture relaxed but alert, like a man who never quite took off the uniform, no matter what his clothes said. They sat for a moment, both sipping from their glasses. The silence between them was the good kind, earned, comfortable. "You stayed," Rip said. "I did." "That's rare." "And he glanced around the bar. "This place remembers." She followed his gaze. "That's why I stayed." Derek and Mason joined them a moment later, pulling chairs from nearby tables and sliding in without asking. The table didn't feel crowded. It felt full, balanced. Tucker brought over a tray with 4 glasses, neat bourbon for Rip and Derek, a light ale for Mason, and a black coffee for Margarett. "You're spoiling us," Rip said as Tucker set the tray down. "No," Tucker replied. "I'm just old enough to know when something good walks in." He gave Marguerite a quick glance. "Besides, it's not every day a bar gets its backbone back." She didn't reply. But she nodded, and, in that moment, Tucker knew it was the highest kind of thanks. For a while the 4 of them just talked. Not about war, not about operations or bases or who did what under which flag. They talked about fishing, about cars that won't start, about the ridiculousness of gas station hot dogs and which town had the best county fair. Derek joked that he once dated a woman who could field strip an M4 faster than he could. Mason claimed he once jumped out of a plane only to land in a cow field and get chased 2 miles by a bull. Rip told a story about drinking expired soda during a dust storm and hallucinating that Clint Eastwood was trying to recruit him for a secret mission in Hollywood. When Margarett laughed, actually laughed, and it felt like air finally filling her lungs all the way for the first time in years. After an hour or so, the front door swung open again. Randon stepped in. This time, no hat in hand, he walked with more certainty, but not arrogance. Just someone showing up because he knew it was right. He approached the bar and nodded to Tucker. "Hey, mind if I talk to her?" Tucker raised an eyebrow but gestured toward the table. "Ask her yourself." Brandon walked over slowly, not out of fear, just respect. "Miss Heathers," he said. She looked up, her expression neutral but not closed off. "I wanted to bring something," Brandon said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small, worn patch. It was from his guard unit. The insignia was simple: shield, stripes, a name stitched across the top. "I talked to my unit commander," he said. "Told him what happened, told him I disrespected something sacred. He made me write an apology letter. To you, to the base. But I wanted to do something more." He set the patch on the table. "I didn't earn what you did, but I want to start earning your respect now." Margarett stared at the patch for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "You stood here," she said. "That's a start." Brandon nodded, turned, and walked back to the bar. This time, when he sat, it wasn't like he was hiding. It was like he belonged. Rip raised his glass. 2 starts. Derek joined, to silence speaking louder than words. Mason clinked his glass, to those who remember. Margarett raised hers last, and to those who stayed. Tucker flicked the jukebox back on. A slow Willie Nelson song rolled out, low and warm. Margarett leaned back in her seat, coffee in hand, and looked around the bar. The ghosts weren't gone. They never would be. But they had found their place here, woven between bar stools and jukebox wires, tucked into cracks in the wood and etched in the air like old smoke. She didn't need to outrun them anymore. She'd brought them home. And in that little roadside bar, under soft lights and the hum of old country music, the war finally let go.